Good evening, folks.
We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family. We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. Bring the family. Bring your friends. We hope you have a wonderful time. Come back soon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Knights of the Pageless Library. This is an audiobook discussion podcast. I am Ryan Knight, and I will be your host for this episode. And on today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look at Outpost, written by Terry W. Ervin II and narrated by Jonathan Waters. This is book one of the Monsters, Maces, and Magic series. If you would like to join the conversation, please feel free to email me. kotpl.pod at gmail.com is by far the easiest way to do that. Even if you just want to comment on how nasally my voice sounds in this episode, I'd be glad to hear from you. I don't know what I got going on. Something caught right in the back of my nose and throat, and I just can't seem to shake it. So here we are. Hopefully it's not too jarring for you guys. I'll try to stifle it as best I can. Now, I was fortunate enough that Mr. Ervin actually reached out to me, both through some YouTube comments as well as an email, and kind of suggested this book to me. So, suggested that he has a few books that he's written that might be right up our alley, just due to the things that we had been reviewing. And I was kind of curious. I had never heard of a LITrpg before, which is what this book is considered. So I was kind of curious, and I thought that's really awesome that he reached out to me and even made the suggestion. So I picked up the book. I was not given the book. Let me make that abundantly clear that I am under no, restrictions here. I purchased this book, and I will give it a fair review, I think. So I'm under no obligations to say anything if somebody has that idea. This book was published in 2018, and the audiobook that I'm listening to was also published in 2018 from Griffinwood Press. I picked this one up through Audible. Again, I'll mention this. If you have another place you like to listen to audiobooks, please feel free to reach out to me and let me know those so I can mention them on the show, because maybe some people don't want to support Audible. For me, it's just the easiest way to get a hold of my audiobooks, as well as we share it as a family. Therefore, any of the books that somebody else purchases, I am able to listen to, and vice versa. So, just works out good for me. Again, I'm open to suggestions. Mr. Ervin also mentioned to me that if this book wasn't quite up my alley, he has a few other different genre type books, but most of his books, especially the ones that are available on Audible, are sci-fi fantasy novels. This one obviously leaning a lot more towards the fantasy end of the spectrum, but he does have a couple that are sci-fi on there as well. Not too terribly many titles under his belt at this point. From what I understand, he kind of does this as a side project. He's a teacher and that's his main job, and so writing is kind of a side thing that he does. So my hat is off to him. He's burning the candle at both ends, I think is how the saying goes. He's putting in the work, and that's excellent. So I'm more than happy to help spread the word of his writings. So if that's not a little bit of a spoiler for what I might have to say about this book. Now, one of the big questions. What about Mr. Jonathan Waters as the narrator of this one? Well, Mr. Waters has almost 300 titles to his name on Audible, should you just search for him. And I will say I was pretty impressed. He has a wide range of voices. This book mostly covering younger folks, both male and female, and then as well some demi-humans and others of the like. He had an extremely wide range to be able to accommodate that, which I appreciate. Now, I did see an article, can't fall into that trap. I saw a post on Facebook in an audiobook group that I'm part of, because I like to kind of keep my fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the industry through Facebook, which is arguably not a great place to do it. Either way, somebody was complaining that they don't like when narrators use so many voices, which I kind of thought was very interesting. I have very mixed feelings about that. I do know some people can go a little too far, or maybe some people think that their voices they are doing are good, and maybe they are subjectively they're not very good. I thought that Jonathan Waters does a great job in this. I like when somebody gives good voices to a lot of characters. Now, to this person on Facebook's point, I worry because there was actually quite a few people who agreed that said they don't like when narrators give voices to every character. My fear is that that just makes this new uprising of AI-generated audiobooks, that it's going to make it much easier for those to slip through the cracks. Because as far as I'm aware, the AI is only able to do a pretty... I mean, it sounds kind of like a human voice. It has a lot of really... It misses out on a lot of nuances that a normal human would speak with, obviously. Doesn't usually have a nasally voice like mine right now. It misses out on a lot of nuances, but it also, for the most part, is a relatively flat tonality that those usually are. Right now, I'm sure they will get better within a couple of years. They'll be able to perhaps perform voices. But my concern is that that's going to pave the way for these AI-generated narrators to kind of encroach into the more broad public, because people don't want the human element, which kind of worries me. I mean, what is the point of having a human read a book to you if they're not going to kind of put some inflections in and make it sound like multiple characters? I mean, if that's the case, why would you not just listen to Microsoft Sam or Microsoft Mike read you a story, or Alexa for that matter? For me personally, I would rather stab myself in the ear with a freaking ice pick, because those robotic sounding voices are the exact reason I want a real person. I want a person like Jonathan Waters who's going to put the time and the effort in to make this story worth my time, right? Otherwise, the AI can just do it, and we don't need a person. So I know there's a really long tangent to say that I really like Jonathan Waters' narration in this. I think he does a great job. I always appreciate a good narrator who is willing to put in the time and the effort and the work to do voices, to do characters, to do, whatever it takes to make each thing that I'm hearing a little more individual. Not all books are going to have that. Not all books are going to have constant characters talking to each other, or, like this book, roughly 5, 6, 7 main characters who are all speaking together at any given time. And a lot of narrators could not pull this off. I have a few that come to mind, obviously, that are some of my favorites that I know could pull this off, and there's a reason that they are my favorites, and that's because they can do things like this, and they can make the stories more engaging, and they can add to the story instead of taking away from it. On the other end of the spectrum, there are times I don't need too terribly many character voices. One that really comes to mind is in Game of Thrones, Roy Dotrice, who doesn't necessarily do a ton of voices. He also doesn't then kind of try to do the voices and screw them up, and, take that for what you will. He has his tone that he holds. He does a couple ups and downs, maybe for a female voice here and there, but otherwise his tone is just him speaking, and that's also fine. And I can see how people can like that as well. But again, it just worries me that it's going to make it real easy for those same people to be like, oh, well, I didn't think the AI generated voice was that bad because I don't like character voices. And that worries me. I wish I was videoing right now, and I wish I had like a picket sign that, no AI in my audiobooks, or some stupid like that. I mean, that is the message I would like to spread. I don't think that audiobooks, for the sake of stories, I don't think the AI has any place in them. Now, I feel strongly about a lot of the AI stuff that's being touted around these days, but especially in these sorts of stories. Do I think AI could read stuff to me and have it be beneficial? Yes, absolutely. I personally use an AI voice during things at work when I maybe don't want to sit there and read the screen, and I can highlight the entire screen and have it read it to me right there on the spot. That is the perfect job for it. Does it sound like a person? No, it doesn't. I know I could pay extra for it too, but I ain't going to do that because I don't want to support it in that way. Those kinds of things, though, I think it's beneficial for, right? I mean, people who, like me, are either lazy, or maybe you have kind of like, you need to read something out to a bunch of people. Now, I'm not a great reader. That's why I listen to audiobooks. So I sound like a clown when I try to even read a paragraph. So it's real easy for me then to highlight it on a conference call and have the AI read it to everybody in the group real quick. It doesn't take anything away. I just don't have to read it out and sound like a fool when I'm doing it. So there are places and times for it. But again, I said all that to say this. Jonathan Waters does great voices, and it really helps this book, in my opinion. I'll get into the story here in a minute and how I felt about it, but I definitely think Jonathan Waters adds to this story, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. Now, some of you may be wondering, as I was before I listened to this, what exactly is LITrpg? Well, according to Wikipedia, if that's where you go for your information, like I do, it's short for literary role-playing game. So what exactly does that mean? Well, in this story, these real-life people are transported into a game. In this case, a role-playing game, which happens to be called Monsters, Maces, and Magic. Now, I asked Terry Ervin to kind of give me his idea of what LITrpg means, because you can also get on, say, Reddit, and there is a little bit of discourse on what exactly does this entail, right? So in this case, these characters are taken into a game world, right? And then the story takes place within the game world, okay? So there's a lot of different things, though, that could kind of fall under that, right? As Terry tells me as well, think about something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? That's technically somebody going through a portal into another world and existing in that world. Now, does that necessarily mean it's like a LITrpg or something like that? No, not necessarily. The difference, I think, is that this story revolves around the idea. So say you were transported into a Dungeons and Dragons game, okay? Now you still have your consciousness and you know the things you know, but you're bound now to the rules of the Dungeons and Dragons world, okay? And that's kind of what happens in this. There's going to be things said like, they failed their saving throw, or I might get a critical hit, or I might roll this, I might do this. Now, the characters are not necessarily rolling dice. Now, to me, kind of what this story comes across as is if I, as the DM, played a game of D&D with my friends, right? And I wrote down and or recorded every detail of how the game went down. I recorded what everybody was saying in the interim and all these things, but I still wrote a story that they're kind of following. And then I recorded our entire session or multiple sessions. And then I turned all of that into a story. That's kind of what you're getting here. Now I'm roughly summing it up, but that's kind of how it felt to me. Eventually, I'm sure there will be some discussions later in the series, which I don't think I mentioned. This is book 1 of, I believe, 7 at this point, and perhaps more to come. But at some point, I'm sure the characters would also discuss things like leveling up and what stats they were going to increase, and generally things that the game world characters do not understand. And that comes up a few times in this book, where the real life characters are saying things that the game world NPCs don't understand at all. And I think this is a pretty interesting concept. It kind of drew me in because I enjoy writing things for like D&D and just world building stuff in general. I'm typically a nerd like that. So this was kind of appealing to me, that you could kind of write world building stuff and maybe not necessarily turn it into a full set of books like Terry Ervin did, but there is a niche for this, right? So maybe you don't have people to play D&D with, but you really like the idea of writing D&D stories. Well, with this kind of genre, you can. You could write a D&D campaign, and then you could put your own characters within it if you wanted to, and run a scenario and write how it comes out. And I think this is kind of an interesting concept, and I do think that it kind of opens up the space a little bit, maybe for people who are not necessarily comfortable coming up with a ton of world building expectations, but maybe you're comfortable with writing D&D stuff that sounds fun. and you like the idea of building characters and leveling up and things like that. So I think this is a really cool little bit of a niche. And I'm sure people would say, well, this is not a niche. It's been around for a long time. You know, people would argue that like Jumanji was maybe something of the start of this kind of genre, right? Where you're sucked into a game world and exist within a game world. I like this as a little bit of an offshoot genre. I think it's interesting that it doesn't necessarily take itself way too seriously like some fantasy series do. And it's just kind of fun, in my opinion. Again, I'm going to get to the story, I promise. And I think also there's something to be said for you can be as strict or as loose with the rules as you want, right? Terry even emailed me and told me that some people would say that his books might not be crunchy enough, right? They don't include enough stats and leveling and specific numbers on dice rolls and character sheets, and these kinds of things can be brought up, or they don't necessarily have to be. And I think that's kind of cool that there are no necessarily hard and fast rules to follow when it comes to this, even though it's its own, genre. Now, I'm sure you're saying, well, Ryan, you idiot, there are no hard and fast rules to writing. And yes, I understand that that's true. But I just think that this is kind of a cool thing, maybe to get, some younger people into writing, just to say, look, it doesn't have to be anything specific. You don't have to write the next Lord of the Rings to write fantasy. You can write stories, long or short, and they can be about a game of D&D you played. Maybe you just want to, you want to do a spin-off of what happened, or maybe your entire party died, and maybe you want to write about what would have happened if they had lived. Like, I just think it's kind of cool. And I know I'm getting way off track from my usual stuff that I say at the beginning of an episode, but let me try to rein it back in here. So how long was this book? This book clocks in right at 7 hours and 23 minutes, which is a pretty quick listen, in my opinion. I mean, I listened to this twice before recording this, and I'm sure I will still screw stuff up. So, Mr. Ervin, if you're listening, please feel free to correct any dumb mistakes that I make in trying to remember the details. Let's go ahead and answer the big questions here real quick. So, is this book easy to follow, even if maybe you're daydreaming a little bit, or maybe you're doing something else while you're listening to it? Yes, I think that it is. We don't necessarily have a ton of location changing, or if we do get kind of different perspectives and character stuff, they usually are staying together, if that makes sense. Even though the party splits up a little bit, they don't necessarily, we don't jump around to different perspectives to make it confusing. Like, wait, where are those people at? Wait, what are they doing? Where would the other people, where did the other people go? What's happening? That doesn't happen a whole lot in this. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to follow, which I think is good. And is this one easy listening? Yeah, I think Jonathan Waters does a great job. He makes this one go down real easy. He definitely adds to the story, which I think is good. And I think this one's, it's pretty short. It's pretty quick. It's kind of fun. It's got a little bit of humor. It's definitely a good book. So now, what's my overall recommendation? I don't think I would recommend this to everyone necessarily. I definitely know there's people I wouldn't recommend this to just because they're not necessarily into anything really nerdy. And that's okay. I don't think that this book has to be for everyone. But I do think there are people, especially if you're into anything that's role-playing, D&D, Pathfinder, any of these kind of role-playing games. I think that there's something to be had here. If nothing else, this book definitely got me a little bit inspired. I haven't written anything for a while, and maybe I will put pen to paper, if you will, and start writing just because this book's kind of inspiring to me for a lot of reasons. Not just because it's a role-playing game type of writing stuff, but just Terry Ervin's story in general. I like the fact that he has a full-time job and kind of does this on the side and is carving out a name for himself. I think that that's very inspiring. So take that for what you will. I definitely would recommend this one, like I said, if you're a nerd like me, and if you don't really like, nerdy stuff, you can still listen to this one. Just don't say I didn't warn you that, it's pretty nerdy. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and pass the spoiler wall. So if you're new here, I'm going to spoil the story. So if you find yourself wanting to listen to this one, please pause the podcast now and go listen to this book, and then come back here and hear what I have to say about it. So this book opens up with who I'm going to call our main character, Glenn, who is a college sophomore who goes to his local campus's kind of game night thing. I think it's like a, Friday night type thing, because he needs to write a paper for his Sociology 102 class. And the paper needs to be about interactions with people that they don't normally interact with, I guess. So Glenn we're given a little bit of a rundown. He's not necessarily a nerd. He maybe likes to play video games, hang out with his friends, do stuff like that. But he said that he had played D&D back when he was like a freshman in high school, but had never really done anything else that was similar. So he kind of thought this would be a good place to get interactions that he might not normally get. And he got the idea from a couple other girls in his class who he also finds once he gets to this place. So once Glenn gets into this kind of game night place, he meets this younger kid who comes up to him whose name is Kirby. And Kirby asks if Glenn is there to game, right? If he wants to play a tabletop game. And Glenn had kind of seen, there's guys setting up like Axis and Allies and maybe some like Warhammer 40k stuff where they're setting up like a ton of miniatures and a bunch of crazy stuff like that. Glenn wasn't really interested in any of that stuff, but he figures if he can sit down and actually play a game, he might have some interactions that would be good for his paper. Kirby says that they're going to play Monsters, Maces, and Magic, which is kind of like D&D, but cooler. And Kirby is actually kind of young. I get maybe that he's like high school age, maybe even slightly younger. But it comes up later that his dad is like a campus security guard, so that's why he's able to kind of get in on some of this stuff. Glenn ends up seeing Steffi and Kim, which are the other two girls that were in his sociology class. So they clearly are also there to gather some information for their papers as well. And they are also invited to play in the same Monsters, Maces, and Magic game that Glenn is by Ron and Derek, I believe are their names. So right off the bat, we got how many characters was that? Glenn, Ron, Steffi, Kim, Kirby, Derek. 6 characters. So there's quite a few characters right off the bat thrown at you to keep track of. And this is going to become a slight problem here in a minute. So they end up going in, and Kirby mentions that their normal GM will not be attending. So I guess this kind of, darker haired, greasier, kind of black clothed dude is going to be running the game. And it doesn't sound like any of these guys are familiar with him. And for some reason, they all just agree to have him run the game. That might happen at some of these things where you just want to play, so you're willing to just jump into a game as long as somebody's running one, which makes sense. So they all roll up some characters. Glenn decides he's going to be a gnome. Derek is a human warrior, and Kirby is going to be a half goblin. So they all roll up some characters on their sheets, and we kind of get a little bit of a feel of the crowd, right? So you got Glenn is pretty quiet. He doesn't really say a whole lot during this whole thing. Steffi is very like an outspoken, probably very good-looking blonde girl. She kind of uses that a little bit to her advantage during all of this, kind of poking a little bit of fun at Kirby, because he's younger, and I guess she likes to see him blush. I don't know. And then you got Ron and Derek, who they play M3, Monsters, Maces, and Magic, together quite a bit. And actually, on my second listen, I did like a little bit of the interactions that happen here in the beginning, because it's a lot of foreshadowing for what's going to happen way later in the story, and I did appreciate that. So the GM kind of comes back in after they all roll up their characters, and he asks them to see him individually one at a time, and they have to sign their character sheets. And when they sign their character sheets, something kind of weird happens. And again, we see all of this from Glenn's perspective, basically. Not necessarily first person, but we're kind of following Glenn over his shoulder when this happens. And they're kind of like signing these with this weird pen, and Glenn kind of mentions how the pen is like really cold, and like some of his finger skin sticks to the pen when he lets go of it. It's very strange. So right off the bat, we know something's maybe a little off. Once they all sit down to actually kind of play the game, the GM gets out like a TV looking thing, monitor, and it's described as being a pretty old looking one. And he turns it on, and there's like a campfire there. And then he hands each person a minifig of the character that they rolled up. It's mentioned that the minifigures look very, very similar to what they described as their character. Glenn kind of mentions that it's almost weird that it looks exactly like the character that he described on his character sheet. The GM tells them all to place their characters somewhere around the fire, and they will begin. Well, as they go to place their characters around the fire on this monitor, they get sucked into the monitor, okay? And they go into the game. And they end up in the scene that the GM was just explaining to them. They're around a campfire. They're traveling with some merchants because they kind of banded together for safety, right, on the road. And right after they get into the game, they're attacked by some goblins and an ogre. The whole group is attacked. They end up having to fight, and this is kind of where the RPG stuff comes in. Like, Glenn is realizing that while he has all this full consciousness of himself as a human and a person in the real world, a lot of this stuff feels different because it's now in the game world, and he's abiding by the game world rules. They end up fending off the goblin and ogre attack, and Kim's character is killed. The one problem I had with this the whole book, the whole time, unfortunately, from start to finish, is once they're in the game world, the characters cannot call each other by their real world name, right? So Ron and Derek and Kirby, when they talk to each other, they call each other by their game world name. So Glenn's character's name is Jax. He's a gnome. Ron's character's name is Lysine. He is a druid warrior. Derek's character's name is Calgor. He is a warrior. Steffi's character's name is Marigold. She is a elf. And I forgot to mention this when they're rolling up Steffi's character. She thinks it's funny that she wants to be like really tall and really busty. And now that she's in the game, it's almost like obnoxious, right? Like she has huge boobs. She's like 6'4". She's super freaking tall, but she's like beyond gorgeous because she rolled such high stats for her appearance. So I thought it's kind of funny. And they're going to lean into that a lot, that she's got huge boobs. You're going to hear about it a lot. Kim's character, I cannot think of the name of her right now off the top of my head, mostly because you don't hear it a whole lot. And then Kirby's character's name is Gurk, and he is a half-goblin, as I mentioned before. So Kim's character is killed during this initial kind of scuffle that they have with these goblins. So now the party has a goal, right? The goal is to find a way to bring Kim back, right? A revive the dead spell, things like that exist within this game world. So now they kind of have a goal to work towards. So now they can set off. Well, the first town they get to, they kind of get into some hijinks, right? Because they approach the temple and they want to do like a tether spell to make sure that Kim's soul doesn't leave her body so they could still revive her. Well, obviously everything costs money. So they got to find a way to get some money. And they kind of go through some hijinks in this first part, right? And they end up at like a gambling hall. And Ron and Derek are going to try to gamble and get some money that way. Steffi, Gurk, and Marigold are kind of just hanging out, and Gurk is like, I'll be back. You know, I'm gonna go take care of this. Well, Gurk's like a little thief, right? Like he goes around and he just is going to try to steal money. And Steffi gets the idea that she's going to get up on stage and basically do like a striptease. And that's the way she's going to earn money because people are tossing coins and stuff up there. Jax ends up there and kind of trying to pick up the money as it's all being thrown up there. And I'm going to go off on one more tangent here. This is what I was kind of saying earlier. So the fact that the characters cannot say their real world names and can only say the in-game names ends up being a little distracting because when the characters are not talking to each other, the narrator uses their real world names. When the characters are talking to each other, they use their in-game names. So now it feels like we have about double the amount of characters that are actually involved in the story because the name Jax and Glenn might be said in the same sentence. And I don't necessarily know that I love that. I almost would have preferred if they had just been referred to as their in-game names once they are pulled into the game. I like the idea that they cannot say their real-world names and only say their in-game names, but I would have preferred then they are just referred to as that through the rest of the story. But that was kind of a minor nitpick. Anyway, back to Marigold's striptease. It gets them in a little bit of hot water because she doesn't end up pleasing the crowd as much as she thought she would have. So they end up having to kind of run, right? They all split up and run their separate ways to get away from this crowd that's about to go nuts if they don't, I don't know, see some titties. And again, we kind of follow Glenn through most of the story, right? So we end up seeing a little bit of the hijinks that he goes through. He ends up meeting this gal at another place. Her dogs try to eat Steffi's bra out of his hands. It's kind of funny. There's definitely a lot of humor, even if it's a little overstayed with Steffi's boobs and how big they are. It is all in good fun, and it's like one of those things that it's almost overstayed to the point where it becomes funny again because it's brought up so much. After kind of all is said and done during that night, they realize they still didn't quite get enough money, but they find out that Girk was able to steal a ring that has like a ruby set into it. And Jack says that he took like a gemstone trait, and he's able to kind of identify these things. And he says that it's like, based on its cut and all these things, it's a legitimate stone that they could sell for about 10 gold. So they end up with like just enough money with this thing to cast this tether spell. And once they're able to do the tether spell, now they're able to get some more time to be able to bring Kim's character back to life. Because they don't know, once they're in this game world, if Kim dies in this game world and they leave the world, if she will be dead in real life. So their goal now is to revive her. I do think that there's a lot of character building here, and I don't necessarily mean that in an RPG term. I mean that in an actual writing term, that the character interactions are pretty good in this book. Some people might say that they're kind of shallow, but I don't think that's true. I think that the interactions of these characters, it feels very real to me, and I do appreciate that. None of the characters are necessarily one-dimensional. Right? Like, oh, this is the mad character. He's always mad. He's never happy. Nothing good ever happens when he's around. That doesn't really happen here. There are kind of lanes that they stay in. You know, like, for example, Derek and Glenn, or Jax and Calgor, they butt heads a lot, right? Because Calgor is very, hard-headed. He's this warrior, right? I'm this big, strong dude, and I beat stuff up. And he kind of makes fun of Glenn because he picked a gnome and he's a healer, and Calgor just thinks that that's not very, that's not very tough, right? That's not very manly. Well, they go back and forth a lot because even though that might be true about Glenn's character, that he's considered, quote unquote, a weaker character, he saves Calgor's ass several times and he heals him and brings him back. By the end of the story, they have a little bit more of a bond built over these kinds of things, and it's good to see that there is some character growth here in this story versus just flat characters who stay the same character right through to the end of the book. I do appreciate that. So once they get the tether spell done, then now they have the real adventure, right? Because in order to get enough gold to cast the Revive the Dead spell, now they got to go on a real adventure, and they're given a task by the temple, and they got to go retrieve this amulet. Okay. And this is where they're like, the real shit starts. But we got to remember, they're only like rank 1 characters. And I'm sure I've already screwed that up. In Monsters, Maces, and Magic, it's rank and not level. And I'm skipping over a lot of details here, I know that. But I don't want to sit here and just tell you the whole story word for word. I'd rather you just go listen to it. So I'm kind of glossing over some stuff. So once they end up going on their real adventure to this, it's like a temple, or it's a dungeon in a swamp, right? Classic D&D stuff. They got to bring like a mule with them, and they have another half goblin that comes with them to bring the pack mule to bring all their supplies, right? And this amulet they're after, I think it makes its wearer invisible to the undead. Okay, so they get into this temple, and in order to get in, they already got to start coming up with some clever like RPG type stuff. Because there's like skeletons guarding the door, and it's this temple where they see a couple other guys go in and they say, I can't remember the exact saying they say, but then they also have these amulets and the skeletons let them through. So the group realizes they got to do something similar, right? They got to come up with a plan to be able to get in and get past the guards. So in order to do that, they end up, I can't remember how they get a hold of an amulet. Honestly, I just listened to this like the other day, and I unfortunately can't remember how they get a hold of an amulet, but they got to fake their way in, talk their way past the guards, and they like Derek's character ends up holding like Ron's character and Kirby's character on his shoulders, wrapped up like in sacks. So it looks like they're bringing stuff into the temple. And then I do think it's funny that Steffi always ends up carrying Glenn because he's small, and she's not necessarily strong, but because of how big she is, she's able to like give him piggyback rides and pack him around and stuff. And she also always sets like her boobs on top of his head because that's, I guess, maybe all the higher he comes up. He probably isn't even that high because she's like 6'4" and he's like barely 5 feet or something, or he's really short. So then once they get in, the real kind of gritty RPG stuff starts, right? They get into fights, we get some rolling, we get some critical hits, some backstab type stuff, and you get in a real fight. The crux of the dungeon, if you will, ends up being like this husk mummy, I believe is what it's called. And it's like a really powerful undead. So remember, these guys are only rank 1. So when they were fighting like skeletons and guards and things like that, it wasn't that bad. Well, this husk mummy is like a rank 3 monster or something like that. It's way outside what they should probably be able to do. And what they end up doing is the husk mummy like paralyzes everybody except Jax. Jax is the only one who succeeds his saving throw and is not paralyzed, but he pretends to be paralyzed while the husk mummy is kind of bragging, you know, what she's gonna do with him, right? She's gonna revive Steffi as an undead to help in recruiting for her army of real people who will definitely appreciate the way she looks. Well, when she ends up turning her back to Jax, Jax has this like club that he picked when he started the game, and it's wrapped in silver at the end. That's kind of its like cool little nuance thing. And I do like that. And I do like that he keeps like a sock over the end of it. I don't know if that's I can't remember if it's to like hide the fact that it has a silver inlay or if it's to keep it from accidentally like hurting somebody. But I do like the subtle little details like that. Jax ends up friggin' whacking this thing, and he busts this like hole in her side because the silver actually does work pretty well, which surprises him. And then he ends up taking his, I can't remember now what it's called. It's a gift that they're given at the beginning. But his was an everlast candle. And I think they were given these gifts basically off of like a random chart that the DM gave to them. And he ends up taking this everlast candle and like shoving it inside this husk mummy. And I had a smile on my face during this because it sounds like a good D&D game, right? Like a character being like, hey, could I try to do this? And the DM being like, yeah, sure, go for it. And then they succeed like a super high roll and you're like, oh shit, it worked pretty good. And that's kind of how this kind of culminates in this, you know, climax of the story, which ends up being pretty awesome. And so Glenn ends up kind of saving the day, right? Even though through the whole story, he's been kind of talked down to that he's like this little character and he's not that useful. And well, at least by Calgore, he's been talked down to. Not everybody else does. Ron doesn't really talk shit to anybody because Ron's like a very level-headed dude and he doesn't say anything that's not like level-headed. So then they end up going back and they retrieve this amulet, right? And they find out that the amulet, the husk mummy was using it to be like, even though she was like undead, she used it to hide from the vampire that was running the place before her and killed the vampire. Anyways, they take this thing back and they're like, okay, we can perform the revive the dead spell now, right? And they do, and Kim fails the freaking saving throw and is not revived right there on the spot. So now they're like, oh shit, what happened? Well, Steffi has a soul gem with her, I believe. So the spirit ends up going into the soul gem. So now the spirit is still there and is still, I believe, can still be revived, which is probably brought up in a later story. But obviously at the time, she's not revived on the spot. So now the party has their next task, right? Let's go to the next thing.
I should also mention too why the party believes that they are in the game. I completely failed to mention that. They believe they might have gotten trapped in the game because Derek and his brother stole a bank bag from like an occult shop or store. And it's believed that maybe their new GM is actually the owner of that store that they stole the money from. And Derek and his brother had already spent the money on spring break, which is what I was talking about before on a second listen. that detail is actually mentioned early on in the story before the party enters the game, which is actually a pretty neat detail. So they think maybe that this GM is annoyed that they stole money from him, and that's now why he trapped them in this game world to get payback on them. I should also mention too that Derek's brother, I believe, is the party's normal GM. So Kirby, Derek's brother, and Ron would be the normal guys who usually play together during these games. And then obviously Glenn, Steffi, and Kim came in just because they happened to be at the gaming night, and that's why they ended up getting sucked into the world as well. And kind of at the epilogue and the wrap-up of the story is the Steffi and Kirby and Glenn sitting around kind of talking about how they're going to get out of this world, right? That's like the overarching thing they need to be concerned with, is getting out of the world. And they talk about maybe doing like a planeswalking spell. That's probably not what it's called. Planar, I can't remember. Teleportation spell, things like that. And Kirby kind of keeps shooting it down because Kirby, even though he's young, he's played a lot of this game, so he knows a lot of the rules and things like that. And Marigold ends up saying something like she wishes something would happen. And Kirby's like, that's it. We got to figure out how to do a wish spell. Perhaps a wish would be the only thing that could get us out of this world. And that's where it ends. The ending was a little disappointing to me, but I do kind of understand it in regards to it's setting up a series of books, right? So I can't be too harsh or critical about the ending because it's obviously left as a cliffhanger to get you to listen to the next one, which I may be doing. I mean, maybe I'll tell you guys about it if you want to hear about it. That's the end of Outpost. And it's called Outpost. I probably should have mentioned this because the adventure they go on at the second part where they end up going to get the Husk Mummy, that's the Outpost, right? Where they end up going. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I think I rambled enough during this episode. I'm looking at my timer and I'm already at like 46 minutes, so I'm going to have to edit this one down. I always think these are going to go quick, and for some reason, once I start talking, I can't stop. So I do apologize for that. But again, if you got anything to say about this or anything else, really, please feel free to reach out. kotpl.pod at gmail.com is the easiest way to get a hold of us. And I really appreciate everybody for listening. I really, really do. I know I haven't been putting out nearly as much as I would like, but I still appreciate every single minute that somebody listens. So thank you very much. And with that, I really hope to catch you in the next one.